So good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's book talk for the teacher of Auschwitz. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able, you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. As mentioned, closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that is the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Today, we are honored to be joined by Wendy Holden. Wendy Holden was a journalist for 18 years, including a decade at the Daily Telegraph. She's the author and co-author of more than 30 books, among them several internationally acclaimed wartime biographies, including Born Survivors, as well as the New York Times bestseller A Lotus Grows in the Mud with Goldie Hawn, and Lady Blue Eyes with Frank Sinatra's widow, Barbara. She lives in Suffolk, England with her husband and 2 dogs, and she divides her time between the UK and the US. You can purchase The Teacher of Auschwitz at the link in the chat. Thank you all again for joining us, and now I'll turn things over to Wendy. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. Greetings from Suffolk in England. It is 3 minutes past midnight here. So I stayed up late, especially to talk to you all. I'm very grateful for the invitation, Isabel. Thank you, and the museum for having me. It's a wonderful thing for an author to be invited by such a prestigious museum to talk about her book, and I'm very honoured to be here. And thank you for taking the time to listen to me tonight. So my name is Wendy Holden, as Isabel told you. I've had a busy career. I haven't really stopped since I was a teenager as a young journalist, and then went on to work for a national newspaper in London and was a foreign and war correspondent for some of that time. I lived in New York in 1989, and I spent a number of years in the Middle East and was the longest serving reporter in Baghdad during the first Gulf War. My interest in war really started before that, though, because my father was much older than the fathers of all my friends, and he'd fought the Japanese in Burma, so he was a veteran of that war, which was a very difficult war. And my mother had been engaged before she met my father, and her fiance, aged 18, was shot dead parachuting into Holland in World War II. So they both experienced war firsthand, never for one moment thinking that their daughter Wendy would end up experiencing war herself firsthand. But of course, that's where my career took me. In my mid-20s, I ended up becoming a foreign and war correspondent for the London Daily Telegraph. Seeing war in all its glory and goriness, if you like, at such a young age was definitely formative for me. And all the stories that I'd heard about war from my parents suddenly came to life. And I really became fascinated, as they had been, in finding the good stories out of war, if that seems unlikely, but it is always, always possible, because wherever there is darkness, there is light. And I started to look for the humanity in the inhumanity. It was something I had done anyway as a journalist, covering all sorts of natural disasters and train crashes and all sorts of horrible things, including Lockerbie. I knew that there were always amazing stories of people who, in the most extreme times, stepped up to do incredible things. And although I've written many books, including celebrity biographies and books about dogs, and various other books, my passion has always been in war. And if you look at my CV, you will see that I keep returning to it. It keeps drawing me back time and again. My first encounter with writing about the Holocaust, although I'd been fascinated by it for a very long time, came in 2013. I was reading something late at night online, and it was an obituary of a woman in Canada who was in her 80s when she died. And she'd had a long and happy life in Canada, but in her youth, as a young woman, she had been in Auschwitz, and in Auschwitz she gave birth to a child who was taken away and killed. And it occurred to me that I had never in my life read about any child surviving the Holocaust, being born in the Holocaust who'd survived. So I started digging, looking online as deep as I could go, and eventually I came up with a name, and it was Anke Bergman. And she had given birth to her baby at the gates of Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. And her baby she named Eva. And I discovered that Eva was still alive. Anka sadly had died 6 months previously, aged 96. She had an amazingly full life with children and grandchildren. And Eva was still alive. And at that point, if I found out she lived in Australia, I'd have got on a plane to go and see her because I thought her story was so unusual and unique and so inspiring. But my very great piece of luck was that she lived an hour and a half from me in Cambridge, England, because she married a law professor at Cambridge University. I went and spent a day with her, and it was a very emotional day for her, very moving for me. Emotional for her because of her recent loss of her mother. So talking about her was obviously something that brought up lots of memories and thoughts and feelings. But she was wonderful, and she welcomed me so warmly, and we made an immediate bond. And when I'd finished working with her that day and asking her about her mother, I asked her if she would do me the very great honour of letting me write her mother's story. And she reached out and touched my arm and said, "I've been waiting for you for 70 years." It was a wonderful moment, and I fully expected to go ahead and write her story. But then she kind of threw me a curveball because she told me that she wasn't the only baby that had been born in the Holocaust who'd survived, and that there were two others whose mothers had been on the self-same journey as her mother, Anka, from the ghettos of Eastern Europe through Auschwitz-Birkenau, past the scrutiny of Dr. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, who asked them if they were pregnant. They were all pregnant, at 2 months pregnant, but not showing yet. And because they were young and healthy, they were selected for slave labor. And each of them had given birth in dire conditions, one on a plank in a factory, one on a train, an open coal wagon in the middle of a deluge, and Eva, Anker's baby, was born at the gates of Mauthausen. Each baby weighed under 3 pounds and the mother's 70 pounds at full term. It was an incredible story of survival and totally inspirational. And though it was a very bleak subject, obviously, I had to immerse myself in their stories and go to all the camps and do almost 2 years of research into the Holocaust. It was also rewarding because I knew right from the start that the babies had lived, it had a redemptive ending. And that book went on to be an international bestseller, sold in 25 countries, and has been translated into 16 languages. And I've been made an honorary sibling by the three babies, which is lovely because I call them siblings of the heart. And they have made me an honorary Jew, which I'm very proud of because I was raised in Church of England, and it was a wonderful thing to do that and to learn about Jewish traditions. I didn't know anything about them until I came upon those three babies who are all 80 and in very good health. Writing that book and the success of that book led me to my next Holocaust survivor, and her name was Zuzana Ruzhishkova. And she was 90 and she was living in Prague, tiny like a bird, beautiful silver grey, bluey eyes, and really rather wonderful. I fell in love with her the minute I set eyes on her. She had had cancer, but she was in remission and she was doing well. She smoked like a chimney. She drank sherry, the British English sherry that I took her, and she ate more than I'd ever seen anybody eat humanly possible, apart from my husband. But she was indomitable, and I thought she would be frail. I thought I'd only get a few hours a day with her, but I ended up spending really from about 11 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night with her every single day as her story poured out of her, as she told me that she had survived 3 concentration camps with her mother, and she had gone on to Bergen-Belsen, where ultimately she was liberated. And music had been her salvation, the music of Johann Sebastian Bach in particular. And after the war, after a suicide attempt, when she realized that she was going to have to go back to grade 1 piano because her hands were ruined from slave labor, she ended up becoming one of the world's leading Baroque musicians. It was while working with Susanna that I heard the name Fredy Hirsch for the first time. She had 3 photographs on her desk. One was her mother, one was her father, and one was this beautiful young man called Fredy Hirsch. And after all the weeks and weeks of sitting with her and hearing awful stories about what had happened to her in the various camps and how she had lost almost every single member of her family, apart from her mother, when she spoke about Fredy Hirsch, something miraculous happened. It was as if a light went on inside her, and she glowed from within. Her whole face lit up. "Fredy," she said. She first met him when she passed out, when she first arrived in the ghetto at Theresienstadt. And she came to, he had smelling salts and he put under her nose, and she looked up into his face and he was a beaming smile. Everybody knew him for his beaming smile. And he asked how she was, and he took care of her from then on, and all of the children that came through that ghetto. Before I talk to you more about Fredy and who he was and where he came from, I'm just going to read you the prologue from the book. It's just 1 page, because it brings Fredy into the room, and I want you to hear his voice. "My name is Alfred Hirsch, although my friends call me Fredy. Please be so kind as to remember my name. The word Hirsch means stag in German, and like a deer, I've been on the run for much of my life. Today, the hunting of Fredy Hirsch will end in a kill. I am not afraid for myself, but for the children in my care. They are all I've focused on since the world started burning, and I shudder to think what might become of them. My name is Fredy Hirsch. I am 28 years old. I'm a teacher. I'm a dreamer. I'm not just a number. Nor will I be identified by the yellow triangle I've been forced to wear. My name is Fredy Hirsch, and I fought to maintain a vestige of normality and decency in this hellish world. I have loved and laughed, cried, and almost died 1,000 times. My name is Fredy Hirsch. I'm a good man. Please be so kind as to remember my name." So Fredy grew up in Aachen in Germany. He was the son of a master butcher and his wife, and he had an older brother, Paul. Fredy really loved being outdoors. That was his thing. He loved outdoor life, outdoor nature. He lived surrounded by forested hills, and he loved to go bird watching. He loved to go up into the woods and walk and hike. He loved to swim in the rivers and the lakes, and that really was his great passion. He was very athletic, very, very good at sports, and he had dreams of one day becoming an Olympian, which of course those dreams were dashed by the rise of fascism and Hitler, because no Jew could ever be on the German Olympic team. When he was 10 years old, his father died unexpectedly and after a short illness, and his mother was left with 2 small boys. For whatever reason, she left them for a while, about a year, with relatives, and she went traveling. And when she came back, she had a new husband. And Fredy never really got over the loss of his own father, so that was an awkward relationship. He found solace, along with his brother, in the Scout movement, which was a massive Scout movement across Europe and, in fact, in America, I'm sure, as well. In the 1930s, it was a huge movement to get children moving, to get them out, to get them outdoors, fresh air, exercise, looking smart, all looking the same, in the same uniform, almost militaristic discipline, and trying to do a good deed every day. That was the Scout motto. And Fredy not only loved it for himself, but he loved it because he found that he was a natural leader. And he really got on so well looking after the younger children who looked up to him enormously. He was always beautifully dressed. He always greased his hair back, combed it back. He always had clean fingernails. His uniform was smarter than anybody else's. He prided himself on his appearance. And the children respected that. And they respected his physicality. They respected the fact that he was so good at athletics and teaching athletics. He hoped, as well as to become an Olympian, that he would then become a youth leader, a professional youth leader, and perhaps go on to be one of the leading lights in the Scout movement in Germany. But of course, everything changed with the election of Hitler and the rise of fascism. And he soon found himself wondering what else he was going to do, because the Scout movement was banned. The only youth group you could be a part of was the Hitler Youth, and of course he didn't qualify for that for being Jewish. And everything that he'd hoped, all his dreams, had been dashed. So he decided that he was going to stay within the Scout movement, which was, and the youth movement, as best as he could, as the Nuremberg laws came into play and made more and more restrictions. He travelled around Germany a fair bit prior to the movement being completely banned, and he worked for other organisations. And he was amazing. He remembered the names of all the children. He was super good with them. He was kind. He was compassionate. He was funny. Everyone remembered his laugh and how compassionate and what good company he was. And then when things became more and more difficult, he decided to flee. He decided to go to Czechoslovakia. He was 15 or 16 years old, a single refugee, going to a country where he didn't even speak the language. There were several reasons for him going. The Nuremberg laws were getting more and more difficult for everybody, and his own family was talking about emigrating. But he didn't want to go. He didn't want to leave his scouts. He didn't want to leave the movement that had been his salvation. There was another reason too. All his male friends were absolutely obsessed with getting girlfriends and talking about girls the whole time, and Freddie didn't feel that way. I don't think he understood why he didn't feel that way. He didn't know anything about homosexuality. I doubt very much he'd ever met anybody who was gay. And he really felt that he wasn't like the others. He felt a sense of great difference, and it bothered him a little bit. And of course, as the Nuremberg laws came into play and homosexuals were also targeted by the Nazis, some of whom were forcibly castrated and many of whom were imprisoned, he found himself in double jeopardy as a Jew and as a gay man. He chose Czechoslovakia even though he didn't speak the language, because the Scout movement that he had been part of had branches there. And he hoped that once he got there, he would be taken in and he would find work and shelter and be looked after, because really there was nowhere else other option for him to go. So he went to Czechoslovakia and he threw himself into that work. And of course, once he got there, he found that there were hundreds of Jewish children, German Jewish children, who had also fled to Czechoslovakia with their families, who also didn't speak the language. So he immediately took it upon himself to take care of them, to look after them. And the elders were only too happy for him to do that. And he also realized very early on that one of the ways to distract children from what was going on in their lives when it was really awful and looked bleak and the laws were getting tighter and tighter, that he discovered that physical exercise was the answer. So he managed to get access to a playground north of Prague called the Hagibor, and he managed to get permission to meet hundreds of children there every Saturday and sometimes in between, and they could come and be free for a day. The Nazis had followed him to Czechoslovakia, of course, and all the Nuremberg laws came in place there too. But and under those laws, of course, Jews weren't allowed to go to cinemas, they weren't allowed to go to theatres, they weren't allowed to own bicycles or radios or pets. They couldn't ride on certain trams. They had to go to the shops much later, when most of the food was gone. And they couldn't cross certain parks. So to get to the Hagibor, children had to walk for miles and miles, sometimes for a couple of hours, from distant parts of Prague, to go round the parks they weren't allowed in and get there. But it was always worth their while, because they had such a wonderful time there. And Freddie organised games, and he, even for the children that weren't athletic, he organized chess games, and he had a clown come in, and there were little plays and shows and things put on, anything to distract the children from what was happening. When the Nazis decided to build a ghetto in Czechoslovakia at Terezin, they called it Theresienstadt, the elders, the Jewish elders, realized very early on that Freddy was one of the first people who should be sent there with the group known as the Pioneers. They were to be sent to prepare this town, this fortress town, about an hour and a half north of Prague, for an influx of thousands of Jews. When they got there, they were shocked. The town itself still existed as a town. Czech people lived there. There were shops, and there was a church, and there were houses and street lamps and trees and parks. But the barracks where the Jews were going to be put, the quarters where they were going to be put, were virtually uninhabitable. They'd been neglected for years. There was no electricity, there was no water, there were no hospitals, there was no kitchens, there were no beds. And so carpenters were sent to build bunks, and Freddie helped with anything he could. He did whatever he could in that pioneer group, excuse me, to help establish the ghetto. And it was very important that they do it very quickly, because within days, 1,000 Jews at a time were being sent by train from all over Czechoslovakia. And these were really eminent people. They were known as prominenti. They were prominent people. They were the great composers and artists and authors and scientists and musicians and mathematicians and philosophers, poets, people who were known around the world for their cultural experience and cultural achievements. And many of them had been sent under false pretenses. They had been persuaded by the Nazis that they should pay huge amounts of money to the Nazis, and then they would be sent to this wonderful ghetto, this showcase ghetto, they called it, north of Prague, and if they paid extra, they would have a nicer room. It was almost offered like a south-facing balcony, like a wonderful place that they could retire to until the war ended, just to keep them safe, because of course the propaganda was such and the anti-Semitism on the streets was such that the Jews were persuaded that they would be safer if they were held together within a fortress town, within walls, protected from the general public. Freddie was appalled when the children started to arrive with their mothers and fathers, because he didn't know what to do with them. They were crammed into these barracks. To begin with, they had to sleep on damp floors or straw or their suitcases or their coats. The mothers were distraught. Many of them had come from very wealthy homes with servants and everything they needed. And suddenly they found themselves with just a few meters of space crammed in with dozens of other women and men and children. Men were kept separately, and the old people were put in the attics and the outbuildings, and very often left to die there. It was a very difficult place from the start. There was a lot of disease, there was a lot of starvation, but the Jewish elders, and Freddie included, did the very best they could within very difficult circumstances. Freddie became one of the youth leaders with another man called Gonda Redlich, and they decided that they were going to try and separate the children, to get the children out of the crowded barracks, away from the mothers, which would calm the mothers down as well. And if they could put them in special rooms, special homes, kinderheims, then they could start to keep them together. They could make sure that they kept clean, very important, to keep the vermin away, the vermin, the lice and the fleas that created typhus and other diseases. They would try to feed them separately so that there was no rush for the soup and the bread and the rations that were sent out, which were very limited, meager rations compared to how many people were there. And they also realized, or Freddie realized very early on, that children like Susanna, who was a young teenager who was very confused and frightened for the future, could be helped too by enlisting them to take care of the younger children. They were known as madrashim. And so they were taken on board as well to help with these children, to manage them, sometimes to sleep overnight in their rooms and keep an eye on them. He also found that he could help with the cultural activities, because he was passionate about music, and he loved theatre as a means of expression for the children. And there were so many wonderful cultural stars in the ghetto who needed to be distracted too from the horrors of what they were experiencing, that he was instrumental in setting up that extraordinary cultural life that they had in Terezin, where they had they put on Verdi's Requiem, remembering it by rote, with a three-legged piano. They managed to get a few instruments smuggled in by the Czech guards. They put on children's shows. Fredy put on a children's show where the children dressed as little flames. Susanna was one of them, in a costume made out of cardboard and scraps of fabric that they had. There was a library for books, so people bought books in their suitcases, and the idea was to put them all into one place and have boxes of books sent to each room so that people could read those books and then give them back, and then they could be carried on and read and read and read around the whole ghetto, because there were tens of thousands of people in the ghetto by this time. In 1943, Fredy was very much in charge, very much considered a guru of everybody there, especially the children. They adored him. He was also a disciplinarian, strict disciplinarian, about cleanliness, hygiene, about a moral code. He became a moral compass to the children. He wouldn't allow any cheating, any lying, anybody who transgressed, who stole another child's piece of bread, or who lied about something, or who cheated somebody, would be removed from the Kinderheim and have to go back to the crowded barracks, which was the last thing they wanted. So he instilled an extraordinary sense of morality in these children. One child who survived the war and had a very long life described it beautifully. She said he built, brick by brick, he built a wall against suffering in their hearts. He was in Terezin in 1943 when a group of children came in to Terezin from Bialystok in Poland, which was very unusual. The trains had been sent out for some time east. The elders were told to choose 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people at a time and put a list together and send them for slave labor, for work camps in the east. They didn't know what Auschwitz was. They'd never heard the name Auschwitz before. And they were so convinced that they were going to be going to work camps that very often their entire families volunteered to go with them because they felt they'd be better off together, not realizing that they were going straight to the gas chambers or to slave labor if they were fit and young. Fredy saw that this trainload of children came in from Bialystok, 1,800 orphans they were described as, and something different happened. It was a very well-oiled machine in Terezin, and up until then, everybody that had come in had been taken off the train, put into quarantine, checked over to make sure they weren't bringing any new diseases in, because they had so many diseases there already, and the doctors and the hospitals that they'd established were overrun. And then they would be released into the community, and they would try and find places for them and take the smaller children into the Kinderheim. But with this particular shipment of children, there was no getting off the train, even though it was extremely hot in August. And eventually they were taken off and taken to a special centre, but nobody normal, nobody regular, none of the regular things happened. Nobody was allowed to see them. And Fredy became very suspicious. What he didn't realise was that they were going to be used, the plan was the SS were going to use them as a bargaining chip for prisoner swaps. But the reason they were kept separate from everybody else was because they had seen and knew about the gas chambers. And they didn't want them telling the other people in the Terezin. So the idea was they'd be kept on the train and kept separately until there was a possible prisoner swap, and then they'd be sent off and it would be okay. Fredy couldn't bear the idea of these children suffering and not getting the care that he thought they deserved. So he defied orders and went over a wall to see them, and for that he was punished and sent first to the small fortress, which was run by the Gestapo, and it's where many were tortured to death and treated despicably. Very few people came out of the small fortress alive. He did get out of the small fortress, and fortunately, and he was sent to Auschwitz, which was the first he knew about it. One thing I would say about Fredy was that he was very clever in working the Germans. He almost played them at their own game. In Terezin and in Auschwitz, he realized that there were several things that the Germans were slightly obsessed about. One was appearance, physical appearance, the Aryan race that they wanted to create. They were impressed by physical beauty, and he was beautiful. Several of them said that if he hadn't been a Jew, he'd have made a marvelous member of the Waffen SS. So they admired the way he looked physically, they admired the way he dressed, they admired the way he spoke High German, he spoke their language. And the other thing he realized about them was their obsession with order and discipline. They wanted roll calls, they wanted numbers, they wanted to fill in their forms, and they wanted everything to be exactly as they hoped it would be. And anything that disrupted that was really irritating to them. And the one thing that will disrupt a plan for discipline and order are children, especially small children. So he realized both of those things and he played one off against the other, against the Germans. Listen, let me take the children out of here and then they won't bother you. I'll look after them. I'll keep them in these places. They'll be fine. And how about I teach them a little German so that they understand your orders and that I could teach them to march. I could teach them to do some militaristic exercises so that if we have to leave altogether, they'll be able to march in line and you won't be disruptive. Oh, and if I'm going to do that, it would be great to go outdoors. We'd need open air, please. We'd like to go onto the ramparts of the fortress. We'd like to be able to give them some fresh air and exercise. It was a constant stream of consciousness going on in his head about how he was going to protect, save, improve the lives of these children who were being imprisoned by the Nazis, in the hope that all hoped that the war would end any day. They'd been hoping that since 1939. And here we were in 1943. When Freddy arrived in Auschwitz, he did exactly the same thing. He took one look at this need for the Nazis to have these roll calls, these appels that they had in the plats in front of the 2 rows of barracks they'd been sent to. And of course, the children didn't understand that. They were running around between legs and crying and asking for food and being a nuisance. So he got permission to take them to a block at the far end of Auschwitz II Birkenau, the Czech family camp, a special dedicated camp that had been set up for this group only, 4,000 people, in case the Red Cross came to visit. That's why they didn't all go to the gas chamber. And he got permission for Block 31 to take all the children in there. I will count them, I will feed them, you give me the food and the soup and I will feed them. And then in the evening they go back to the barracks to sleep and then they come back to me in the morning and your roll calls can go ahead with adults only and it'll be so much better for you all. And they agreed, including Dr. Joseph Mengele, who was the angel of death, who had featured in Born Survivors because he'd examined each of the mothers too. So he had decided that he was going to take charge of this as head of health. He was going to take charge of this children's block and this children's camp and this Czech family camp. He wanted to take the credit for it because it was a good idea. He even had other the heads of other camps come and visit to see what they were doing there, as if it was his idea, if it was his experiment, not Freddy's, because he wanted to show off, look at this, we've figured out a way to handle the children. And the crazy thing was, and the strangest thing was, and perhaps the most evil thing is, that along with all the other SS officers, these men would be one morning at the head of the railway ramp, sending thousands of men, women, and children straight to the gas chamber, those who hadn't been set into a special camp in case the Red Cross came. They would go straight to the gas, and then they would come into the Czech family camp and go into the children's block with sweets for the children and sit down and bounce them on their knees and play with them, maybe thinking of their own children back home or their own families. Several people have said to me, how could you humanize them? How could you humanize people like Mengele and show that he was doing that when he was killing so many and doing unspeakably evil things in his experimentation block? But I think that just depicts him as even more evil. That's that's what happened. It wasn't a question of me imagining it. It's what happened. It happened a lot. And I think that that just illustrates how more evil they were, because there was some shred of humanity or human connection, a need for human connection in those people, and yet they still went back out and sent even more to their deaths. It was an incredible time for Freddie because he was completely in charge of the children and he had free rein for a while. He really did everything he could to make their lives better, including getting hold of some paint after he'd discovered that an artist that he'd known in Czechoslovakia was in the camp. He got hold of some paint from the resistance or from Canada, the warehouse, they called it Canada, where all the clothes and belongings of everybody who was gassed were put and sorted. And he asked this artist, Dina Gottliebova, to come in and brighten up the drab walls of Block 31. He ended up getting Block 31 and 32 because he had so many children to care for. And she started just drawing a little Swiss scene to start with, a little balustrade and some flowers and some black and white cows on a hillside. And she realized after a while that the noise had completely stopped in the block and she couldn't hear children talking and singing and playing anymore as they normally did. And she turned and they were all watching her in a semicircle around her. And she said to them, "What would you like me to draw?" And in unison they cried, "Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs." And that must have been fate, because Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was one of the last films that anybody was allowed to see that was Jewish in Europe. It came out before the war, just before the war, and people were able to see it. Children saw it, adults saw it. It was miraculous, technicolor, cartoons, extraordinary and fun and beautiful. And then the Nuremberg laws came in, banning Jews from going to the cinema. But Dina Gottliebova was so obsessed with it and so desperately wanted to become a cartoonist for Disney one day that she went to see it, even though it was against the law. She hid her yellow star and she snuck into the cinema, the film theatre, and she watched it 7 times and memorized almost every scene. So you can imagine how amazing it must have been for her when the children all clamored Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because it was the one thing she could recreate almost perfectly. And years later, and by the way, she became a cartoonist for Disney, which was fantastic. And years later, she recreated it for Yad Vashem, and you can see pictures of it, exactly what she had recreated. Freddie did all these little things. He managed to get some books from Canada. He managed, not very many books, I think maybe 10 or 12 maximum. And he managed to get them in, and so that there was some books that the teachers who were up until then teaching by storytelling, they had no books, they had no paper, they had no pen, but they were telling their stories that they remembered and how they used to structure their lessons from memory. But to have these books was incredible, even though they were often very inappropriate. One, I think, was The Psychology of Sigmund Freud. And there was a maths book and I think an atlas. And he put a couple of the teenagers in charge of looking after the books if the SS came into the block, so that they could be hidden, because that was banned, that was illegal, and that he could have got into trouble. Everybody could have got into trouble. They could have been killed. Let's face it, they were in Auschwitz. They were in the shadows of the smokestacks. Freddie also put on a little show, lots of shows, but the main show he put on was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Of course he did. It was on the walls. They all knew it. Only there were so many of them. There weren't 7 dwarves. There were probably 30 dwarves, because all the children wanted to be dwarves. And he had people come and help make little costumes out of scraps of cardboard, paper, whatever. And he put the show on, and Joseph Mengele came with some of the other leaders of other camps and many of the senior SS, and watched and listened to a beautiful singing voice, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, even as just outside in the snow, more and more people were trudging through the snow towards the gas chambers, thinking they were going to have a shower. And one can only hope that they heard that beautiful voice of the lead singer singing Snow White songs, and took some solace from that before their own dreams were turned to ash. I'm not going to tell you what happened to Freddy Hirsch, because I want you to read the book yourself. Some of you may know some of his story already, and some of you may know that there are 2 different versions of what happened to Freddy Hirsch. And I want you to come to it because I want you to understand for yourself how it played out, based on the witness and survivor testimonies I have come across and the people that I spoke to. I told you right from the beginning that Zuzana Ruzhishkova was the person who first told me about him, and I dedicate the book to her because she was very important to me, for lots of reasons, not only because I adored her, but because I left her on the Friday and she died on the Tuesday. She never even saw her own book published. But she did desperately want Freddy's story to be told, and it was one of the last things she asked me. "Wendy, please, one day, write about Freddy Hirsch." And it took me a while. Since 2017, I had some other things going on and other books to write, but I finally have come to write this story. And I'm just so grateful that I have this story to write, because it's truly one of the most inspirational stories I've ever had the fortune of writing, and I've written many wonderful stories about extraordinary people, but it's humbling and such a privilege to capture the voices of the voiceless. It's a novel. It started off as a non-fiction biography, but when I was doing my research as a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and somebody who takes the history side of it very, very seriously, and I've never embellished Holocaust stories in any way, but I ran out of material, and about halfway through, the archives just dwindled. After the war, Freddy was denigrated by the communists who took over Czechoslovakia and Poland. They denigrated him because they were homophobes, they denigrated him because they were anti-Semitic, and they denigrated him because they accused him of being a collaborator, even though his collaboration was never for himself, it was always for the children. And so any documentation that there was about him was destroyed by them, and there just wasn't enough material for me to get under his skin and really write his story. So I decided to switch to fiction. I have written fiction before, and it's harder for me, definitely. It's more of a challenge. But once I started, once I got his voice in my head, there was no stopping me, because I really felt that I understood him. I really felt that I knew him in some way. And so it's been an interesting and fascinating and wonderful journey for me. And I'm just so glad that I've been able to bring his voice to the world, because this book is now published in 26 countries. One of the things that I discovered when I was writing about him was that he wasn't anybody ordinary to start, extraordinary to start with. He was just an ordinary little boy who lost his dad, who found solace in the companionship of the Scouts and his hope for a brighter future, and a chance to be an athlete, to be an Olympian. And it was the darkness of war, it was the darkness of the Holocaust that finally lit the spark within him, that turned him into an extraordinary human being. And that's what I find so inspirational, as with the mothers in Born Survivors, who were ordinary Jewish housewives, happily married, expecting to live a long and fulfilled and happy family life, nothing more. And yet the circumstances they found themselves in turned them into these incredibly courageous, brilliant women who not only survived the war without their husbands, without their homes, without their possessions, without anything by the end of it, just their babies. They then went on to raise those children to be life-enhancing, beautiful children and grandchildren. So the legacy continues. The voices of the voiceless, I call them. It's always so humbling to write these stories, and they stay with me forever, and Fredy Hirsch will definitely stay with me. I read you the prologue. My name is Fredy Hirsch. Please be so kind as to remember my name. And when I do these presentations and talk about Fredy, which I've been doing for the last 7 months around the world, I always end the same way. They say that hope is a candle in the darkness, and Fredy Hirsch was a candle in the darkness of the Holocaust. And a single candle is enough to light a certain amount of the darkness. But the wonderful thing about a single candle is that a million candles can be lit from it. And what I ask people to do at the end of my presentation is, at some point this week, light a candle for Fredy Hirsch and light a candle for hope, because our world has never needed it more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy, so much for that incredible presentation. As I mentioned in the beginning, we will now have some time for audience questions. So thank you, everyone in the audience who has already written in with their questions. But of course, if you're inspired with more questions as we're speaking, do feel free to put more in the Zoom Q&A box. Also, we do have some questions that are slightly similar to each other, so I will be combining sort of similar questions, just if you don't hear your question asked word for word, that's why. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. Um, Wendy, we'll start with a couple of people have been asking about the reaction to your book, and you just mentioned that you've been giving these talks all around the world, and it's been published all over as well. So we have some people wondering what the reaction has been like, and also specifically, since you're based in the UK, if readers in the UK have reacted differently than readers in the US, or if it's been sort of similar across the board.
It came out in January in the UK and it was in the bestsellers charts for 5 weeks. And then it's just recently been published in paperback and is selling really well. I'm very gratified to say. It was only published for the first time in America 3 weeks ago. So the reaction, I don't know yet, but I'm hoping to get reaction from you. Please read it and put wonderful reviews on Amazon and Goodreads and all those places and say great things about it. It's very important to an author these days. But so far, the reception has been extraordinary. I've got nothing but 4.8 sort of star point reviews on Amazon and Goodreads, and some wonderful comments and feedback from people who are so moved by his story, and like me, can't believe that he was virtually forgotten for 80 years and that nobody's really written about him before. Certainly not in English.
Well, thank you so much, and it's definitely, hopefully, many of our viewers tonight will be among the first people reading the book in the US, although I know we have people from all over. Um, we have a couple other questions about the research process for your book, and you touched on it briefly earlier in your decision to switch to historical fiction. But we have a couple people who are wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that early research process was like and what sort of primary and secondary sources you found helpful or you were able to access.
Yes, the research side of it is very important for me. And actually, in the back of your book, the book, you will see that everything is listed, all the bibliography. And I also, for transparency's sake, list the fictional characters and the real characters,
Mm.
so people can see what was fictional and what wasn't. But even the fictional characters, every single fictional character is based on a snippet of real information, a
Mhm.
name or a mention of a character or a mention of a particular person and something that they did, and then I've just taken that and created the character around it, given them a bit more of a backstory, so that the story flows and that it works in with Freddy's story. So yes, the research side of things is one of the best things for me. I say that when I start a new book, I feel like I'm standing at the bottom of Everest and I can't even see the peak for the clouds. It feels like such a massive mountain to climb. But of course, the more that I write about the Holocaust, to a certain extent, the more I'm plagiarizing my own brain, because of course I've been to Auschwitz, I've been to Terezin, I've been to Bergen-Belsen, I've been to all these different places and some of the slave labor camps as well. So I don't necessarily have to go in person again, but I have
Mhm.
a stockpile of photographs, I have a stockpile of memories,
Mhm.
and there's so much material online. I'm also helped enormously by archivists who I'm indebted to at the
Mhm.
Imperial War Museum in London and at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I often speak, and at the Illinois Holocaust Museum in Chicago, which is where I launched the book in America on
Wow.
June 19. So yes, it's a lot of reading, that's for sure. It's a lot of digesting information, and of course, the Shoah Foundation videos are so important for a historian like me because I can look up I can type in the name Freddy Hirsch, and anybody who has given a Shoah Foundation testimony who mentioned Freddy Hirsch comes up on my screen, and then I can watch those testimonies
Mhm.
and see what they had to say about him. And the loveliest part about that really was that every single person I saw talking about Freddy had exactly the same reaction that Susanna did, that
Mhm.
their faces just lit up. And they just, oh, Freddy Hirsch, Freddy
Mhm.
Hirsch, wasn't he wonderful? And talked about him so beautifully. And I was also able, apart from Susanna, who told me about Freddie, I was able to speak to Dagmar Liblova before she died. She was in Susanna's group of women that were together in Terezin. I was also able to speak to a man called Frank Bright
Mhm.
actually in England, who was in hospital not very far away from me, and his daughter said that he would be very happy to talk about Freddie. He'd always wanted
Mhm.
to talk about Freddie. And the best part of all was that I discovered that Dieter Kraus was still alive, and Dieter was one of the teenagers who was asked to look after the books when the SS came in. And she had a novel written about her called The Librarian of Auschwitz. So people may know her through that. And she's still alive. She's in her 90s. She's living in Israel. And she very kindly read the manuscript for me in first draft form. And I was really nervous about what she would say, especially as I'd fictionalized it. And she came back almost straight away, and incredibly, she gave me a quote for the cover, which says that this narrative is the closest possible narrative any person who didn't experience these things herself could have written. It will finally do justice to Freddie and all those children. And it made me cry. It made me cry because it was such a wonderful, wonderful endorsement, but from somebody who not only knew Freddie, but knew him in Terezin and knew him in Auschwitz and worked in Block 31, just like Susanna. So I really felt that I had the endorsement, and I had the feeling from all the survivors that I spoke to that they were just so thrilled that somebody was finally honoring Freddie Hirsch.
Thank you. It's always so interesting to hear about the research
Yeah,
people do.
yeah.
Before we move on, we have one last question about the research portion of this book. Someone asked if you speak any Czech or German, and if not, if you encountered any language barriers or any similar issues while doing your research.
Well, after Born Survivors, I said I would never write another book in Czech again because there are a million accents over every single name. And it was just a nightmare to get it all right. And then, of course, I wrote about Susanna, and that was in Czech. And now I wrote about Freddie. So that'll teach me. But no, I've never mastered any Czech apart from to order food and drink, which is very important. Excuse me. My German is rudimentary. My husband is fluent in German, which is helpful. And he lived in Germany for a while, and so I've picked up some German from him. But thank goodness for Google Translate. And when it's something that's very complicated or dated language, then I will hire a translator and have it translated properly. Yeah. Good
Thank
question.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And as we're looking at the wonderful cover to your book, we had a couple people write in just recently and are asking what inspired the image on the cover, and in particular, if the butterfly is symbolic of anything, or if there's any larger meaning behind why you chose that image.
Yes, it's interesting. I had a discussion, shall we say, with the publishers about the cover, because in the Czech family camp, of course, they didn't have striped uniforms. They were allowed to wear their own clothes. But I was persuaded that when you've only got a few seconds to attract a reader's attention, if you like, either online as a small little image, very often on Amazon or something, or on a bookstore website, or in a bookstore where you're just overwhelmed by the covers, a striped uniform has become a shorthand for the Holocaust. So it was a way of conveying exactly immediately what it was about. The butterfly, interestingly, in the English version, this was the original butterfly, and that was a yellow butterfly. And I liked the idea of either a bird or a butterfly to symbolize the innocence of children. And I chose yellow for this cover because I felt that was to do with the yellow star. It was a nod to that, and the Jews that were so badly treated there. And then when it came to the American cover, they actually went the extra mile, and the designer, who did a super job, discovered actually researched butterflies that would have been in Poland at that time. And this particular butterfly, I don't know the name of it, but it's beautiful, was an authentic Polish butterfly, and so they switched it and made it slightly different. And I love them both equally. The covers actually in different countries are so unusual and so different. A lot of them have gone with the original, but some of them are really unusual and different. There's one that's in Italy. It's called Il Maestro Invisibile, which means the invisible teacher. And it's just a picture of Freddy Hirsch, because there were photographs taken of him when he was when he was at the Hagabor in doing athletics, and he's basically in athletic shorts and topless, and doing a wonderful sort of pose where his hands are in the air and he's on the tiptoes, and that's the cover. And it says there's not one word about the Holocaust or anything to do with him. It's just that, and you know, it's a really interesting, brave cover, but I love it.
Thank you. I'm so glad that somebody asked that question because what an
Yes.
interesting answer. So great question. Um, you mentioned some photographs of Freddie, and we have a couple people writing in who are interested in being able to access photographs, and they're wondering if you have any advice on where might be good places to look for photographs and other archival documents relating to his story.
Well, Google, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
just if you type Freddie Hirsch's name in, it's Fredy, unusually.
Mhm.
Just one D and no IE, Fredy, Hirsch, Hirsch. If you type that in, the archive photographs come up. They come from various sources, from Terezin archive, as well as the USHMM, Yad Vashem, and so on. And there were lots of photographs taken of him, because prior to him being sent to Terezin, when he was in Prague, the Jewish newspapers loved what he was doing with children, and they followed him and they took photographs. In fact, there's one wonderful photograph of him where they had him pose in his athletic shorts as the statue Discobulus, a Greek statue Discobulus, which people will kind of know. It's like, he's like in a certain pose like this. And the reason they did that was a direct rebuttal to Hitler, because Hitler so admired this statue that he wanted it for himself, even though it was in the Vatican or somewhere wonderful and safe, thank goodness. But he wanted it himself because he felt it was the epitome of the perfect Aryan. And they had Freddie pose in that pose exactly, to say, well, here you are, Hitler. Here's a perfect Jew.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I hope everyone can find that picture. I know certainly after we log off, I'm gonna find it
Yeah.
for myself.
Yes.
We're just almost at the top of the hour, so we won't be able to get to everyone's questions. So apologies in advance, but thank you for your participation. We have, I think, time for one more question. And someone submitted this question, which I think is a nice one to end on. Personally for you, Wendy, what is next? Do you have any projects in the works or anything that people should keep their eyes peeled for?
Yes, well, I always have projects in the works, and there's two possibilities for my next World
Mhm.
War II book, which will probably be fiction, actually. I've sort of got the bug now. But in between time, when I'm not writing about the Holocaust, I have what I call my antidote books, because it's a dark place to be an author focusing on the Holocaust, because you are spending so much of time alone with your mind. So
Mhm.
I do have books in between that are more uplifting, and I was very privileged to be invited by Audrey Hepburn's son, Sean, to co-write the first ever authorized biography of her. And then one of the reasons I was chosen was because her life began and ended with war. She'd
Mhm.
been half-starved by the Nazis in Holland as a child, and then she ended up being the UNICEF ambassador for war-torn children and so on. So it was a marvelous project, and I'm just halfway through editing it now, and that'll be published worldwide in May, I think, next year. So look out for that one. It's called Intimate Audrey.
Thank you. I think everyone will definitely keep an eye out for that one. And thank you so much for sharing all of this with us this evening, especially considering how late at night it is for you. So considering that, especially, I won't keep you or any of our audience members over time. But thank you again, Wendy, so much for joining us today. Thank you to our audience again. I highly encourage everyone to purchase The Teacher of Auschwitz, which you can do at the link in the chat. I've just put that again in the chat for everyone. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support. We also hope to see you for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. Both of those links are in the chat for you as well. You can also watch past programs and view and share today's recording, which will be available next week on the museum's YouTube channel. So thank you all again so much. We hope you have a great evening, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.